The stage lights were warmer than I expected, warm enough that I could feel them on the back of my neck as Nina Alvarez adjusted her microphone and turned to face me, her smile bright and professional, the kind that's been trained not to waver on camera. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying easily through the auditorium, "please join me in honoring a true Tucson hero, retired firefighter Harold Doyle, whose sacrifice 25 years ago cost him his hearing, and whose family's remarkable fundraising efforts have inspired this entire community." I stood there in my dress uniform, the one I hadn't worn since Carol's funeral, feeling the applause more than hearing it, a dull, textured vibration through the floor, and the hearing aid in my good ear, the closest thing to sound I'd experienced in years from a room this large. In the front row, I could see Ryan clapping, his jaw set in a way I recognized from his childhood, the particular tightness he got when he was performing calm he didn't actually feel. Beside him, Jessica clapped too, her smile aimed at the cameras with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned, somewhere along the way, exactly how a smile should look when it's being recorded. Nina turned back to me, and something in her expression shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, the kind of change you'd only catch if you'd spent 30 years learning to read a room before deciding whether to run into it or pull someone out of it. "Before we present the medal," she said, "I understand there's been a fundraising campaign in your name that's raised quite a significant sum over the past year. I wonder if you could tell us a little about how that money's been used." I felt the room's temperature change before anyone said another word. Somewhere behind me, near the edge of the stage, I saw Frank Merrick rise slowly from his seat in the third row, a mylar folder gripped in one weathered hand, his eyes fixed not on me, but on his own daughter sitting in the front row, her smile finally visibly beginning to falter. I turned toward Nina, my heart doing something slow and heavy in my chest. "That's a good question," I said quietly. "I think it's one I should have asked myself a long time ago." If you found this story tonight, I'm glad you did. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. It helps more than you'd think to know real people are on the other end of this. A brief note before I continue. This story blends fiction with purpose, crafted for entertainment and the lessons worth carrying home. Names and details are coincidental. What you take away from it, though, is entirely yours to keep. I want to tell you something before I tell you everything else. There's a version of what happened on that stage that Jessica probably tells people now, if she tells it at all. In her version, I imagine, it's a misunderstanding, a technicality, numbers that look worse out of context than they actually were. I understand why a person needs a version like that. It's hard to live inside the plain truth of what you've done, especially when the person you did it to is standing under stage lights, medal in hand, still not entirely sure what's about to happen. I can only tell you my own version, plainly, the way I was trained to report a fire scene, no embellishment, no speculation, just what I actually saw and what actually happened, in the order it happened. My name is Harold Doyle. Most people call me Hal. I'm 66 years old. For 30 years I worked as a firefighter here in Tucson, Arizona, the last 12 of them as a captain at Station 12. I lost most of the hearing in my left ear a long time ago, on a night I still think about more often than I let on, and I've spent the years since learning to live comfortably enough in a world that's grown a little quieter than it used to be. I raised Ryan to understand what it means to run towards something everyone else is running away from. He became a firefighter himself, followed me into the same house at Station 12 eventually, and for a long time, I thought that meant he understood, all the way down, what courage actually costs a person. I still believe some part of him does, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this actually began, not on that stage, not with Nina Alvarez's careful question hanging in the air. Let me start 25 years ago, On a night a warehouse fire changed the shape of the rest of my life and gave me a debt I never once thought to call in. The call came in at 2:47 in the morning, a warehouse fire off Grant Road, the kind of blaze that announces itself from 3 blocks away with a glow that turns the whole sky the wrong color of orange. I was 36 years old, a lieutenant then, second truck on scene. By the time we arrived, the structure was already fully involved, flames punching through the roof, black smoke rolling out low, and thick the way it does when you've got chemicals or old insulation feeding it something it shouldn't be fed. The call went out over the radio almost immediately. A worker still inside, trapped in a back office near the loading dock, cut off from the main exit by a section of collapsed shelving. That worker was Frank Merrick. I didn't know his name yet, not then. I only knew there was a man somewhere inside that building who wasn't going to have much time left if somebody didn't go get him, and I was closest, geared up, already moving toward the door before my captain finished giving the order. I want to be honest about what that decision actually felt like, because it wasn't the kind of clean, heroic clarity people sometimes imagine. It was loud and hot and disorienting, visibility down to almost nothing, my radio crackling with instructions I could barely make out over the roar of the fire consuming everything around me. I found Frank curled against a filing cabinet, one leg pinned beneath a fallen shelving unit, coughing so hard he could barely speak. I remember his eyes finding mine through the smoke, wide and terrified, and underneath all of it, somehow still hopeful, the particular look of a man who has decided, against every instinct telling him otherwise, to trust the stranger who just walked into the fire to get him. I got the shelving off him. I got him moving toward the door, his arm across my shoulders, both of us stumbling through smoke that had turned the air into something closer to liquid than gas. We were 15 feet from the exit when a support beam gave way above us. I don't remember the impact itself, not clearly. I remember the sound before it, a deep, groaning crack that some part of my brain, even in that chaos, recognized as structural failure. I remember pushing Frank forward, harder than I probably needed to, and I remember the world going sideways and very loud, and then, on my left side, disturbingly quiet, all at once. We both made it out. Frank walked away with a broken leg and smoke inhalation, nothing that didn't heal completely within a few months. I walked away with permanent sensorineural hearing loss in my left ear, a gift from a piece of falling timber that came close enough to matter, but not close enough to take anything worse from me. Frank Merrick has called me his hero for 25 years since that night. I never once let myself think of it that way. I think of it, still, as the job, the thing you do when someone else's life is on the other side of a decision you don't have time to overthink. I didn't know, standing in that hospital hallway 25 years ago, that the debt Frank felt he owed me would eventually become tangled up with something far more complicated than gratitude. Carol passed 5 years ago, a heart attack, sudden enough that there was no long goodbye, no chance to say the last things people usually mean to say before it's too late to say them. I've made a kind of peace with that over the years, though I'll admit some days it sits heavier than on others. I retired from the department not long after, my hearing having declined further with age the way most things do once you've crossed a certain threshold. The left ear entirely gone by then, the right ear compensating in a way that worked well enough for daily life, but left me relying more and more on hearing aids that never quite restored what the years, and that one particular night, had taken. Ryan had followed me into the department a decade earlier, young and eager in a way that reminded me powerfully of myself at his age. He worked his way up steadily, made lieutenant faster than I had, and eventually met Jessica through, of all things, a mutual connection neither of us fully appreciated the significance of until much later. Jessica Merrick, Frank's daughter. I remember the dinner where Ryan first brought her home, remember watching Frank's face across the table when the two families finally connected the dots. His daughter dating the son of the man who'd pulled him out of a burning warehouse a decade before either of them was born. Frank had cried a little that night, unabashedly, the particular emotion of a man who feels like the universe has handed him a strange and generous kind of symmetry. It's like the debt just keeps finding ways to come back around, he told me, gripping my hand across the table. I'll never be able to repay what you did for me, Hal. Never. I told him, the way I always told him, that he didn't owe me anything. I meant it. I've never once, in 25 years, wanted Frank Merrick to feel like his gratitude was a currency I expected him to keep spending. Ryan and Jessica married 3 years later. I stood up and gave a toast, the same kind of toast fathers give, about family finding its way to itself in unexpected shapes. I didn't know yet, standing there with a glass raised, that Jessica would eventually find a very different use for the story that had brought her two families together, that the same warehouse fire that cost me my hearing and gave Frank a second chance at his life would someday become raw material for something neither Frank nor I ever would have agreed to if we'd understood, from the start, exactly what it was going to become. The idea came from Jessica, about 8 months before that stage in the community center, framed with what I believed, at the time, was entirely good intentions. "Hal," she said one Sunday dinner, "your hearing aids are, what, almost 7 years old now. There's newer technology, way better than what you're using, but insurance barely covers any of it. I want to set up a fundraising page. Tell your story, the fire, my dad, everything. People respond to stories like that. I really think we could raise enough to get you properly set up." I remember feeling genuinely moved by the offer. I'd never been particularly good with technology, had certainly never considered something like online fundraising for myself, and the idea that Ryan and Jessica wanted to do this for me, publicly, felt like exactly the kind of gesture a father hopes to see from his children eventually. "I don't know the first thing about setting something like that up," I told her. "You don't have to," she said. "I'll handle all of it. You just focus on getting better hearing aids." The page went live within 2 weeks. Jessica had written the description herself, a genuinely moving account of the warehouse fire, of Frank's rescue, of 25 years living with permanent hearing loss as the cost of running into a burning building for a stranger. She'd included an old photograph of me in uniform, another of Frank and me at Ryan and Jessica's wedding, arms around each other's shoulders. I want to be honest, reading it for the first time, I cried a little myself. It felt strange and moving to see my own life described that plainly, that generously, by someone I loved. The donations started slowly, then picked up considerably once a local news blog picked up the story a few weeks in. Small amounts, mostly $20 here, $50 there, occasionally something larger from someone who'd apparently known me, or known of me, from my years at Station 12. I signed up for the alert notifications Jessica set up on my phone, and I remember watching the total climb, 5,000, then 15, then, faster than I expected, past $50,000. "That's incredible," I told Jessica, genuinely stunned. "That's so much more than I ever imagined we'd raise." "People love a hero story, Hal," she said, smiling. "Don't worry about any of the logistics. I've got it all handled." I trusted her completely. I want you to understand that clearly, because it matters for everything that came after. I had absolutely no reason in that moment to think there was anything to question. I kept using the same 7-year-old hearing aids for months after that conversation. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed, the way you assume things about people you love, that everything was simply moving through whatever process these things move through. I had no idea yet how wrong that assumption actually was. Before I go any further, let me pause here for a moment. If you're still with me, drop a comment below and let me know. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. It helps more than you'd think to know there are real people listening on the other end of this. A quick reminder, this story blends fictional elements into its storytelling, crafted for reflection as much as entertainment. If it isn't for you, this is a good place to step away, no hard feelings at all. But if you're staying, what I found out next is the part that changed how I understood everything that had happened over the previous year. Sam Ortiz and I had worked together for over 20 years before he took over as battalion chief, and we'd stayed close after my retirement, the kind of friendship built on enough shifts and shared danger that it doesn't require much maintenance to stay solid. We met for coffee about 10 months after the fundraiser launched, our usual spot, a small place 2 blocks from Station 12, where half the conversation always eventually turns back to the department, no matter what we start out talking about. "Ryan and Jessica get a new place?" Sam asked, somewhere in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable conversation. "Saw them pulling into a driveway on Col Vista last week in a brand new truck. Nice one too." I remember the small, strange lurch in my chest. Not suspicion exactly, not yet, just a mild dissonance, the way you feel when two facts that should fit together somehow don't quite line up. "They didn't mention a new house," I said slowly, "or a new truck." Sam shrugged, clearly not thinking much of it. "Maybe I'm wrong. Might have just been visiting someone. You still doing okay with those hearing aids, by the way? Heard you all raised a good chunk of money for new ones." $80-some thousand, last I checked," I said. Sam raised his eyebrows. "For hearing aids, Hull, top-of-the-line units run maybe 6-7 thousand for a pair, even the fanciest ones on the market. What happened to the rest of it?" I didn't have an answer for him. I realized, sitting there with my coffee going cold, that I genuinely didn't know, that I'd never once asked Jessica for an itemized account of where the money had actually gone, because I'd trusted her completely, because questioning it had never once occurred to me as something a grateful father should feel the need to do. I went home that afternoon and looked, for the first time in months, at my hearing aids, still the same 7-year-old model I'd been wearing when Jessica first proposed the fundraiser, still working well enough, but nowhere near what $80,000 should have been able to provide. I sat in my kitchen for a long time that evening, turning Sam's question over and over, feeling something shift beneath a trust I hadn't realized, until that moment, I'd never once verified. I ran into Frank at the coffee shop near the fire station about a week after my conversation with Sam, an unplanned meeting, the kind that happens naturally in a city small enough that former colleagues and their families keep crossing paths. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, though he still carried himself with the same wiry energy he'd had 25 years earlier, even with the slight limp that never fully left him after that night in the warehouse. "Hal," he said, sliding into the seat across from me with the easy familiarity of a man who considers you family, whether the paperwork says so or not. "Jessica told me about the fundraiser doing so well. 80,000, is that right? That's remarkable." I hesitated for a moment, weighing how much to say. "It is remarkable," I said carefully, "though I'll be honest, Frank, I'm not entirely sure where most of it went. I'm still using the same hearing aids I had before it started." Something shifted in Frank's expression, not suspicion exactly, not yet, but the particular alertness of a man whose instincts had just been quietly triggered. "I did the books for a produce distributor for almost 30 years before I retired," he said slowly. "I know my way around a ledger better than most people give a retired guy credit for. Would you want me to take a look, just to put your mind at ease, one way or the other?" I thought about it for a long moment. Some part of me resisted the idea, a lingering loyalty to Jessica, a reluctance to formalize a suspicion I hadn't fully let myself forget. But Sam's question had been sitting in my chest for a week by then, growing heavier instead of lighter. I'd appreciate that, I told him. Frank got access to the fundraising platform's donor records the following week. Public information. Technically, since Jessica had never made the account private, simply relying on the fact that no one had ever thought to look closely enough to ask. He called me 3 days later, his voice carrying a weight I recognized immediately, the tone of a man who's found something he genuinely wished he hadn't. "Hal," he said, "I need you to sit down before I tell you what I found." I sat. Roughly $15,000 went toward actual medical expenses, your original hearing aids, a few related appointments, he said. The remaining $65,000, near as I can tell, moved into a personal account, Jessica's account, Hal. Listed in the transfer records as administrative and management fees. I sat in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, feeling something cold and quiet settle into my chest. "There's one more thing," Frank said, his voice unsteady now. "This is my daughter, Hal. The daughter of the man you saved. I don't know how to reconcile that with what I'm looking at. I am so sorry." I didn't confront Jessica right away. I want to explain why, because it mattered a great deal to what happened next. 30 years of firefighting teaches you something about timing that translates, in strange ways, into the rest of a person's life. You don't rush into a structure before you understand what's actually burning, and where, and how far it's already spread. Rushing gets people killed. Patience, even under pressure, saves them. I asked Frank to keep everything he'd found documented and organized, printed, undeniable. I didn't ask him to confront Jessica either, not yet. Some part of me needed to understand the full shape of what had happened before deciding what to do about any single piece of it. 2 weeks after Frank's call, Sam Ortiz reached out with an invitation. The department was hosting its annual community recognition ceremony, honoring several retired firefighters for service and sacrifice, and Sam wanted me included. My name had come up, he explained, partly because of my own record, and partly, he admitted a little sheepishly, because the story of the fundraiser had circulated enough locally that someone on the planning committee thought it would make a wonderful, uplifting segment for the evening. I thought about declining. Some part of me wanted to handle this quietly, privately, within the family, sparing Jessica the public exposure regardless of what she'd done. But I thought, too, about the $80,000 donated by strangers, people who'd read Jessica's careful, moving description of my sacrifice and given money they believed was going toward my care. I thought about what I owed them, people who'd trusted a story enough to open their wallets for it. I called Nina Alvarez myself, a local reporter I'd met years earlier during a different department story, someone I remembered as thorough, careful, unwilling to take a narrative at face value without checking it first. "I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need your help figuring out the right way to bring it into the light." Nina listened without interrupting, the way good journalists do, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Hal," she said, "are you sure you want to do this publicly, at the ceremony, in front of cameras?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. "I spent 30 years running into buildings other people were running out of," I said. "I think I can handle one uncomfortable evening, and I think the people who gave that money deserve to know the truth, even if it's hard for my family to hear it." Nina agreed to prepare a few careful questions, framed gently but honestly, giving Jessica the chance to explain herself in front of the cameras before anything more formal happened. Frank asked to be there too, sitting quietly in the audience, the folder of bank records in his lap, ready if it was needed. I put on my dress uniform the morning of the ceremony, the same one I hadn't worn since Carol's funeral, and I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment, thinking about a fire 25 years earlier, and a debt of gratitude I'd never once asked anyone to repay. I hadn't expected, all these years later, that debt would be the very thing that finally exposed the truth. Nina's question hung in the air of the community center for what felt like a very long time before anyone moved. I understand there's been a fundraising campaign in your name that's raised quite a significant sum over the past year, she'd said. I wonder if you could tell us a little about how that money's been used. I looked out at the audience, found Frank rising from his seat in the third row, folder in hand, and I looked finally at Jessica, whose smile had gone brittle and frozen in a way I recognized immediately as the exact moment a person realizes the floor beneath them has already given way. I think that's a question better answered with actual records, I said into the microphone, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. Frank, would you mind coming up? Frank walked to the stage with the same measured, deliberate pace I remembered from 25 years of watching him move through life carefully, gratefully, after nearly losing it entirely. He opened the folder under the stage lights, and Nina, professional to the end, held her microphone toward him without hesitation. I did the books for a produce distributor for 30 years, Frank said, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. I know how to read a transfer record. $82,000 was raised for Hal Doyle's hearing aid care. 15,000 of that went toward actual medical expenses. The remaining 67,000 transferred into a personal account under the name Jessica Doyle, labeled, repeatedly, as administrative fees. A murmur moved through the audience, low and uncertain, the particular sound of a room recalculating everything it thought it understood about the evening. Jessica, Frank said, turning slightly, and I watched something break in his voice, the particular pain of a father addressing his own daughter in front of strangers. You're my daughter. This man saved my life. I don't understand how you could do this. Jessica had gone very pale in her seat, her hand gripping Ryan's arm hard enough that I could see the pressure of it even from the stage. Ryan stood up slowly, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning, horrified understanding. Jess, he said quietly, is this true? She didn't answer immediately. The cameras kept rolling, Nina's crew capturing every second of a silence that said, in the end, everything the bank records already had. I stood on that stage, medal still in a velvet case someone had set on the podium behind me, holding a piece of my own history, the fire, the beam, the 25 years of quiet gratitude that had somehow been turned into a fundraising campaign for someone else's benefit, and felt something more complicated than anger. I felt mostly exhausted. Jessica, I said finally into the microphone, my voice quiet but carrying. I'd like an answer too, please. Jessica stood slowly, her hand still gripping Ryan's arm, and for a moment I thought she might simply walk out, the way people sometimes do when the truth in a room becomes too heavy to stand inside of. She didn't walk out. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking almost immediately, loud enough for the microphone near the front row to catch it and carry it through the room. I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to become this. She wiped at her eyes, mascara already streaking, the composed woman who'd smiled for cameras an hour earlier now unraveling in front of the same audience she'd once hoped to move with a carefully written story. We were drowning, she said. Ryan's overtime pay wasn't covering the mortgage after the rate reset last year, and I had credit card debt from before we got married that I never told him about, and it just kept spiraling, and then the fundraiser started doing so well, and I told myself I'd just borrow a little, just enough to catch us up, and I'd pay it back before anyone noticed. Her voice cracked entirely on the last few words. I told myself Hal's story deserved to be told regardless, that the fundraiser doing well was still a good thing even if I was taking more than I should have. Ryan was staring at his wife with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was a boy, the particular devastation of watching someone you trusted completely reveal themselves to be someone else entirely. "You used my dad," he said quietly, then louder, anguish breaking through. "You used the story of him losing his hearing, saving your own father's life to steal money from people who trusted us." "I know," Jessica said, sobbing now, openly. "I know what it looks like. I know what I did." Frank stood beside me on the stage, his own face a complicated mixture of grief and fury, a father confronting the worst version of a daughter he'd raised to be better than this. 25 years I've told that story," he said, his voice thick. "Not as fundraising material, Jessica, as gratitude, as the reason I got to walk you down the aisle at all. You turned the reason I'm alive into a con." I stood there under the stage lights, medals still uncollected on the podium, and I found myself, strangely, not reaching for anger the way I might have expected to. "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't hurt," I said quietly into the microphone, my voice carrying across a room gone almost entirely silent. "It does. But I've spent 30 years learning that the fire is rarely the only thing burning in a situation like this. There's usually something underneath it that's been burning a lot longer, unseen, until it finally reaches the surface." I looked at Jessica, tears streaming down her face, Ryan's hand slowly, hesitantly finding hers despite everything. "I think we have a lot to talk about," I said, "but not here, not tonight, in front of cameras. This part, at least, should happen as a family." Before I go on, let me pause here for a moment. If this story has reached you tonight, drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had someone use your own hardship, your own sacrifice, as a story they profited from without your knowledge? I read every comment, and it means more than you'd think to hear from you. A gentle reminder, this story carries fictional elements, woven in for reflection as much as entertainment. If that isn't for you, this is a good place to step away, no hard feelings at all. But if you're staying, what happened after that stage is the part I still think about most. We didn't stay for the rest of the ceremony. Nina, to her credit, handled the broadcast carefully, focusing her coverage on the fundraising transparency issue rather than turning the family's private grief into an evening of spectacle. The story ran the next day on the local news, factual and measured, exactly the way I'd hoped it would. Jessica returned the remaining money within the month, working with a lawyer. Frank recommended to structure repayment in a way that avoided formal fraud charges, though the fundraising platform itself flagged the account and suspended it permanently. The department opened an internal review of how the campaign had been publicized under its informal endorsement, and going forward, any similar fundraisers require a designated independent trustee, a policy change Sam Ortiz personally pushed through, citing my situation directly as the reason it mattered. Ryan and Jessica separated 3 weeks after the ceremony, though not, as far as I understand it, permanently. They're in counseling now, working through not just the fundraiser, but the debt and shame Jessica had been carrying silently for longer than any of us realized. I don't know how that part of their story ends. I've decided it isn't mine to predict, only to hope for. Frank and I sat together the week after the ceremony, the same coffee shop where he'd first offered to look at the books, and for a long while neither of us said much of anything. 25 years, he said finally. I thought I'd finally found a way the universe was giving something back to you, through my family. Instead, my own daughter took something from you all over again. I thought about that for a long moment before answering. You didn't take anything from me, Frank, I said. You gave me the truth when you didn't have to. That's worth more than whatever Jessica took. He nodded slowly, and for the first time since the ceremony, I saw something in his face ease, just slightly. The money that was recovered, a little over $60,000 once legal fees and platform penalties were accounted for, went, finally, toward the hearing aids the fundraiser had originally promised. State-of-the-art units, better than anything I'd imagined needing at 66 years old. I wore them for the first time on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, sitting in my own kitchen, and I remember being startled by how much sound had been missing from my life without my fully realizing it. The hum of the refrigerator, the specific pitch of birds outside my window, sounds I hadn't fully registered in years. I sit most mornings on my back porch now, coffee in hand, listening to sounds I'd nearly forgotten existed. The particular rustle of the mesquite tree in the yard, the distant hum of traffic 3 streets over, birdsong sharp and clear in a way it hadn't been in years. Frank comes by most Sundays. We've fallen into an easy rhythm, the two of us built on 25 years of a debt neither of us ever asked the other to repay, and strengthened now by something harder won, the honesty it took for him to hand me that folder, knowing exactly what it cost his own daughter. Ryan visits regularly too, alone for now, working through whatever needs working through before he and Jessica decide what comes next. He's quieter these days, more careful, the particular carefulness of a man who's had to reckon with how much he didn't ask, how much he simply trusted without verifying, in a marriage he thought he understood completely. I don't know yet what happens with Jessica. I've told Ryan, and I've told myself that I'm willing to let that story unfold at its own pace, without my anger accelerating it or my forgiveness rushing it. Some fires, I've learned over 30 years, need to burn themselves out fully before you can safely walk back into what's left. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. Courage isn't only the thing that happens inside a burning building. Sometimes it's an old man standing in front of cameras, willing to let an uncomfortable truth become public, because the people who trusted a story deserved better than a lie dressed up as gratitude. Sometimes it's a father choosing his integrity over his daughter's comfort, even when it costs him something he can never fully get back. I'm not angry anymore, not the way I was that night on stage. I'm mostly just grateful for Frank's honesty, for Sam's offhand comment about a truck that started all of this, for a room full of strangers who cared enough about a stranger's hearing to donate in the first place, even though their trust was used the wrong way for a while. This is what a quiet revenge dad means to me. Not cruelty, not anger, just an old firefighter who spent his whole life running toward the truth, even when it was burning inside his own family. If this story reached you tonight, leave a comment and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story on this channel. Thank you for staying until the very end. A last gentle note. Some upcoming stories on this channel contain fictional elements, crafted for reflection and life lessons. If that isn't for you, no harm.